During your academic career, you will be asked to complete many different types of assignments. This tutorial contains helpful tips and examples on how to effectively understand requirements to make the process as smooth as possible. Reading an assignment carefully gives you a good idea of what you're being asked to do before taking significant action. This saves you time and frustration as you're completing an assignment. When you receive an assignment, whether it's for a research paper, an essay, an exam, an annotated bibliography, reflection, literature review, or presentation, your first job is to read through the instructions so you can understand what is being required of you. Instructions for assignments can typically be found in your class syllabus, in your Engage shell, or from your professor during class. Once you locate your instructions, read them over a couple of times and begin to identify the following: objective elements, action words, audience and context, subjective elements, the larger picture, and any clarifying questions. Objective elements are often clearly defined logistical requirements that have little to do with the subject of the assignment. Objective elements can often include things like due date, length, number of required sources and their types, and formatting information like citation format. It can also include things like type of assignment, grading rubric, method of submission, etc. This is the first step of reading an assignment because it creates the foundation for your outline with elements that do not change. Objective elements should require little to no interpretation to be understood. Action words are verbs which indicate the main purpose of an assignment, like analyze, discuss, research, compare, explain, or argue. Note that most assignments will be asking you to add your own voice and synthesis, unless otherwise indicated. For example, if you are asked to compare two arguments, it is likely not enough to simply summarize their claims. Look for additional action words in instructions or a grading rubric to guide you. It can be difficult to gauge how much background information or context to provide when you're writing a paper or completing a project. This will depend on who's reading your finished product, which varies based on the type of assignment. Identifying the type of assignment, audience, and context can help you determine how much background information is necessary. A research paper in an intro-level course should have a significant amount of background information, even if your professor is already knowledgeable on the topic. Students who take intro-level courses do so in order to master foundational knowledge, and your professor likely wants you to demonstrate that mastery. Writing a reflection paper that will be read by your professor about a classroom activity will not likely need a long explanation of what the activity was, as this was a shared experience, and a reflection paper is usually emphasizing your response. A presentation at Academic Symposium will have a large audience with varying amounts of knowledge on your topic, so you should likely establish some basic knowledge before explaining your project or paper. Regardless, you should always aim to provide enough information so your audience can follow your thesis and understand why you have incorporated certain sources. Considering who your audience is helps in determining how much of this to include. Subjective elements require a certain amount of background knowledge or interpretation to define. This is different to the objective elements we covered earlier, which tend to be things that do not require interpretation to understand. Subjective elements can look like words such as reliable, relevant, or appropriate, as these have different meanings dependent on context and interpretation. If you're unsure what these mean for your project, make sure to read through the entire assignment fully and identify any context clues that might be helpful. Consider asking your professor for clarification. This we'll cover later in the video. After identifying the context, audience, action words, objective and subjective elements, put them together to determine the assignment requirements as a whole and where you may need to fill in the gaps. This is your opportunity to consider the broader goals of the assignment, like what kind of thinking your professor is asking you to do. This will give you an easier time in knowing if you're headed in the right direction, as it helps unite the assignment requirements and makes them more cohesive. Look for context clues about the scope of the assignment. This can include questions for you to consider or answer in the assignment title, or any assignments you've already completed. For example, if you've done an annotated bibliography and a literature review before writing a research paper, you likely need those assignments to help guide your research and writing. Are you learning a new skill or demonstrating proficiency through the assignment? Are you boosting writing or research skills? These are good questions to ask yourself or your professor if you're having trouble understanding the requirements altogether. Asking questions is an essential part of academic inquiry and is to be expected when you're given an assignment. Always read through the assignment fully and make a good effort at understanding the instructions before reaching out to your professor. A librarian or student support staff can help you in identifying questions or subjective elements in an assignment, but ultimately your professor, or whoever is grading you, will make the final decision on what an assignment's requirements mean. Now, let's take all of these elements and apply them to an example. You are a student in an intro-level English class and you've been assigned a paper. As we read through the assignment, we can begin to determine objective elements, such as type of assignment, due date, page length, amount of sources, and citation format. This is an argumentative research paper that will be between 5 and 6 pages long, is due March 15th, and must use at least 5 sources, and also be formatted in APA. Next, let's look for action words, or what we will be doing in the paper. I see defend, argue, and present. In this paper, I will be taking a position and defending it by using sources and synthesizing their arguments to prove my thesis. There will also be a presentation element to the paper, so it will require more than just writing and research. The default audience for any assignment is always your professor, but in this assignment, you will also be presenting to your classmates, so you will have multiple audiences to consider when writing the paper. You're also being asked to demonstrate topic knowledge, which indicates that you need to provide background information regardless of what your professor or classmates' knowledge of your topic is. When considering the larger picture, consider the elements you've already identified and think of them as a whole. In this assignment, I'm being asked to write a paper where I choose a topic, create a thesis, and defend it using sources I find through research. This project is broken up into different stages, which you will complete before writing the final paper. Each stage is related to an element in the grading breakdown, which gives you a good idea of the kinds of thinking your professor wants you to do for this project as a whole. Now that we've read through the assignment and can understand its requirements, let's start to identify any questions we may have. This can require some reading between the lines for requirements that are not as explicit as others we've identified. If you don't know where to begin, think of the subjective elements you found. For example, you can ask for clarification as to what reliable and appropriate sources look like for this project. These words can mean different things to different people, and you can ask your professor for guidelines or examples. Should you be using academic or popular sources? Should you include any peer-reviewed articles? Since this is a research paper, this is likely an important clarification to make. Another element you could consider is the presentation to your classmates. There aren't specific guidelines in this document on what the presentation should include. Are you creating a PowerPoint, a handout, facilitating a discussion? Knowing more about your presentation will help you manage your time effectively so you're not caught off guard. Each of the elements we covered in this tutorial are simply starting points you can use to better understand an assignment's requirements. Note that if you're still unsure of what's being asked of you after reading through an assignment, contact your professor or whoever is grading you for any final clarifications. Thank you for watching, and if you want assistance in reading an assignment beyond this tutorial, please contact the reference librarian at reference@annamaria.edu or visit the library during open hours.